Okay, so you know how we're always plugged in, right? Like phones, lights, computers, all running on electricity.
Always on. Yeah, seems like it.
Exactly. But have you ever actually thought about what it takes to make all that electricity? I mean, beyond just the obvious stuff, like power lines or wind turbines, there's this whole other connection to something that's, well, even more essential than electricity.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are you thinking of?
Water.
Water.
Really? Yeah, water. Turns out traditional power plants use a surprising amount of it. Like, a lot. It kind of makes you see your electricity bill in a whole new way, doesn't it?
It really does, especially considering how crucial water is becoming, with climate change and everything.
Right, and that's where this really fascinating study comes in. It's out of LUT University in Finland, and they dove deep into this whole water and energy connection.
So what's the study call?
The title is a bit of a mouthful, but it's Global Scenarios for Significant Water Use Reduction in Thermal Power Plants Based on Cooling Water Demand Estimation Using Satellite Imagery. And it paints a really detailed picture of this, well, kind of critical relationship between our energy needs and water resources.
Satellite imagery, huh? That sounds high-tech.
Oh, it definitely is. And for everyone listening, if you're the type who's curious about how the world works and the big challenges we face, this deep dive is especially for you.
Definitely important topics, especially now.
Totally. Water security is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and the way we connect our need for energy to our water supplies, what experts call the water-energy nexus, is right at the center of it all.
Makes sense. So what does this study actually tell us?
Well, it doesn't just point out the problem. It actually goes a step further and uses data to show how we can drastically cut down the water used by power plants. Some real game-changing stuff in there, I think.
Well, I'm ready to have my mind changed then. Lead
Yeah.
the way.
Okay, let's do this. So, our goal today is pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack this study, really dig into the current water footprint of power plants around the world, and then see what potential there is for shrinking that footprint in the years to come. So, first things first, we've got to understand the basic link between water and the electricity that powers so much of our lives.
All right, back to basics. Sounds good.
Exactly. Now, over to you. What's the deal with water and power plants?
What's all about cooling? You see, most power plants, what we call thermal power plants, generate electricity by using heat to create steam, which then spins turbines to generate electricity. Now, this heat can come from different sources.
Like what?
Well, it can come from burning fossil fuels, your coal and natural gas, and it can also come from nuclear reactions or even burning biomass. But regardless of where the heat comes from, they all need water for cooling.
Okay, that makes sense. They're creating all this heat, so they need something to cool things down.
Exactly. These processes generate immense amounts of heat, and water is incredibly effective at absorbing and carrying away that heat. It basically prevents the whole system from overheating and breaking down.
Right, kind of like how a car engine needs coolant to keep running. And it's interesting, because it's not just that the power plants need water. Getting the water to the power plants also takes energy.
You got it. Think about all the steps involved.
Yeah.
You have to extract the water from a source like a river or a lake, then treat it to make it suitable for industrial use, and finally pump it to the power plant. All of that requires a significant amount of energy in itself.
So it's like this two-way street, this water-energy nexus. And it sounds like it's a pretty delicate balance to manage.
It is, and it's a growing concern, as this study points out.
Because it's not just about how much water we have globally, is it? It also affects how reliable our electricity is.
Precisely. Water scarcity, a problem that's often made worse by climate change, can really impact a power plant's operation. We're already seeing this around the world, power plants having to reduce how much electricity they generate or even shutting down completely because the water's too warm or there's simply not enough of it for cooling.
I mean, we rely on electricity for everything these days, so if the supply isn't reliable, that's a big problem.
Huge problem.
Now, this study uses two terms, water withdrawal and water consumption. Can you explain what those mean?
Sure. Water withdrawal is the total volume of water a power plant takes from the source. Could be a river, lake, or ocean to use for its cooling.
Okay, got it.
And water consumption is the portion of that withdrawn water that isn't returned to the source, usually lost through evaporation.
So it's like if you take a big glass of water, that's withdrawal, and then you drink some of it and the rest evaporates, that's consumption.
Exactly. Perfect analogy.
So what did this study find out about the current global water use by these power plants? Like, what were the numbers back in 2015?
For 2015, they estimated that thermal power plants worldwide withdrew a massive 500 cubic kilometers of water.
500 cubic kilometers. Wow. Can you put that into perspective?
To give you an idea, 1 cubic kilometer is about 400 billion gallons, which is enough water to cover the entire state of Rhode Island in almost a foot of water.
That's mind-blowing. And how much of that was fresh water?
Out of that total, 290 cubic kilometers was fresh water, the water we need for drinking, agriculture, and ecosystems.
Those numbers are massive. And what about the water that was actually consumed, not just withdrawn?
In 2015, it was estimated that global water consumption by these power plants was 25 cubic kilometers, with 18 cubic kilometers being fresh water. So while the total water taken out is huge, the portion that's permanently lost through the consumption is less, but still a significant amount.
Okay, so we've established that this is a big deal. But who are the biggest water users for electricity generation?
Based on their 2015 data, China, the US, India, and Russia were at the top for both freshwater and total water consumption.
Any particularly striking numbers?
China's annual freshwater consumption was almost 6 cubic kilometers, and the US had the highest withdrawal rate, taking out a massive 102 cubic kilometers in 2015.
Wow.
That's 35.7% of global freshwater withdrawals just for the power sector, all from one country.
Really puts things into perspective, right? Okay, so they laid out the current situation, but this study also looked ahead, didn't it? Projected future water use.
Exactly, but before we go there, I'm curious how they even got all this data in the first place. Analyzing over 13,000 power plants, that's a monumental task.
Absolutely. But they were really clever about it. They mainly used freely available satellite imagery from platforms like Google Earth, Bing, and Yandex.Maps. They could actually see the location of each power plant and even figure out what type of cooling system it used just by looking at the images.
That's brilliant. But couldn't some power plants be tricky to analyze just from a satellite image?
Right. For those, they had a backup plan. They developed this statistical method where they looked at historical data and tech trends for specific power plants in different countries, like coal-fired versus natural gas, that sort of thing.
So by looking at patterns over time, they could make educated guesses for the plants where the images weren't clear enough.
Precisely. It was a mix of direct observation and using historical data to fill the gaps.
Clever approach. But how did they know if a power plant was using seawater or fresh water?
That's where GIS comes in, Geographic Information Systems. They basically mapped how close each power plant was to coastlines, rivers, and lakes. They set up these buffer zones, like 20 kilometers from a coast probably meant seawater,
Makes sense.
and 5 kilometers from a river or lake most likely meant freshwater. But with all these methods, how confident were they in their results?
To ensure accuracy, they compared their findings on cooling systems and water sources with official data from organizations like the US EIA, the Energy Information Administration, and other studies.
Checks and balances, good.
They found they were 81% accurate in identifying the cooling system and 93% accurate with the water source.
That's pretty impressive.
It gives their overall estimates a lot of credibility.
Okay, so they've got a solid understanding of water use in 2015 and a pretty robust methodology. Now, what about the future? The study talks about these two contrasting scenarios. The best policy scenario, or BPS, and the lifetime scenario, or LTS. What's the difference?
These scenarios explore how water demand from thermal power plants might change, depending on policies and our commitment to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. The BPS outlines a world where we transition to a net zero greenhouse gas emissions economy by 2050.
Net zero by 2050, ambitious.
It is, and relies on achieving a 100% renewable energy system using the LUT Energy System Transition Model. It basically aligns with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so BPS is the proactive green route. What about the LTS?
The LTS is more of a business-as-usual approach. In this scenario, power plants operate until their expected decommissioning dates based on their lifespans.
No rush to switch to renewables.
Right.
So, under the BPS, how much reduction in water use did the study project by 2050?
Their projections are actually quite impressive. By 2050, they estimate a 98% reduction in water consumption and around 95% in water withdrawal compared to 2015 levels.
A 98% drop. That's huge. Does the lifetime scenario even come close?
No, not even close. The LTS shows a much slower decline. It really shows how impactful proactive policies can be in cutting down our water footprint, especially when focused on transitioning to renewable energy.
Policies really do matter. This study also looked at the impact on specific rivers, right? Because so many power plants are located near freshwater sources.
That's right. They found that 55.5% of the world's thermal power plant capacity is located within 5 kilometers of major rivers and lakes, relying on fresh water for cooling.
Being so close to freshwater sources must put a lot of pressure on those rivers. Which ones are feeling the most strain?
The Ohio, Yellow, and Mississippi rivers are currently dealing with the highest levels of water consumption from power plants. When it comes to water withdrawal, it's the Yangtze, the Mississippi, and the Tennessee.
All really important rivers for ecosystems and everything.
And the Yangtze has the highest overall water withdrawals for power generation globally.
The study also focused on the Danube River, right?
Yes, they used the Danube as a case study.
What made the Danube so interesting?
It's considered one of the world's most endangered rivers, according to the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Plus, it flows through so many countries, making water management complex. They identified 63 power plants within 10 kilometers of the Danube.
And what did they find out about those power plants?
In 2015, these plants along the Danube withdrew about 6.19 cubic kilometers of water and consumed around 0.12. A lot of this water use came from nuclear power generation in the region.
Interesting. So how did different countries along the Danube compare?
Well, Germany had the highest consumption because they use more cooling towers, which tend to consume more water through evaporation. Bulgaria had the highest withdrawals, mainly due to their coal and nuclear plants.
So even along the same river, the impact can really vary. What did the best policy scenario project for the Danube's future?
The BPS projected a 73.9% drop in water consumption from the Danube within the first 10 years, mainly because of older power plants being decommissioned. But water withdrawal doesn't decrease as quickly at first.
Why is that?
Well, a lot of the remaining plants, especially the nuclear ones, use ones through cooling systems, which need a lot of water, even if a smaller portion is actually consumed. But the good news is, the model predicts almost no water withdrawal from the Danube for power generation by 2050 under the BPS.
Oh, no water withdrawal by 2050. That's amazing. All that water could be used for other things. This study also mentions this cumulative difference between the LTS and the BPS. What's that all about?
It's basically the total water saved between 2015 and 2050 by following the best policy scenario instead of the lifetime scenario, like all the water that would have been used under the LTS but isn't needed with the BPS.
So how much water are we talking about?
It's a lot. The study estimates that by going with the BPS, we could avoid withdrawing 168.5 cubic kilometers of fresh water and consuming 29.4 cubic kilometers globally between 2015 and 2050.
That's a huge amount of water.
The safe consumption is particularly important because that's water permanently removed from the system, gone forever.
Makes sense. And just to highlight how big that is, that saved water is like the yearly domestic water use of a very large country. Okay, so this really underscores the long-term benefits of switching to renewables. And speaking of renewables, the study touches on their role in all of this, right?
Absolutely. The study highlights that solar and wind power have way lower water withdrawal and consumption rates than traditional power plants. Like, for every megawatt hour of electricity generated, renewables use only 2 to 15% of the water withdrawn by coal or nuclear, and just 0.1 to 14% of the water consumed.
That's a massive difference. So it's not just about cleaner air, it's about using less water, too.
Exactly, and this study really backs up what a lot of energy experts are saying. A high percentage of renewables in our energy mix isn't just possible, it's economically smart, especially with the right policies.
It makes the best policy scenario not just a dream, but something we can actually achieve. So this deep dive into the study has been really eye-opening. It seems like the key takeaway is that shifting towards renewables, like what the best policy scenario suggests, is a major opportunity to reduce the impact of electricity generation on our water resources.
That's the core of it. The amount of water used by thermal power plants right now is a serious challenge, but this research shows that switching to renewables is a real practical solution.
It's a solution we need if we want to lessen the strain on global water resources, especially when you think about how interconnected water, energy, and food systems are. It's like a chain reaction.
Very much so.
So, for everyone listening, think about what this means for energy policies and investments, not just globally, but in your own communities and countries. What can we all do, from governments to businesses to individuals, to make this transition to a more sustainable energy future a reality? It's something worth thinking about.
It definitely is. Thanks for taking the time to discuss this important research.
And thanks to everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.